Hello and welcome to my video where I'm going to show you two different ways to repair seams. I'm going to be doing this demonstration on some knit fabric in the form of sweatpants. As you can see, these sweatpants have seen better days. The seams have completely come apart and I'm now going to show you how to hand sew those back together. You're going to need some sewing thread in a colour that matches the item of clothing you're repairing. I'm going to be using some white contrasting thread so that you can see what I'm doing clearly. You're also going to need a hand sewing needle and some sewing pins. I'm going to show you two different repair methods. The first is going to be the backstitch and the second is going to be the ladder stitch. Now make sure to turn the clothing inside out. And then you need to pin those seams in place. Make sure that when those seams go back together, there's no gaps and there's no ripples in the fabric. I find it a lot easier to repair seams than any other repair because there's no fabric that's been lost. It's not like you have a hole in the fabric, it's simply just ripped along that seam line. Therefore, the edges of the fabric should fit together nice and neatly. Ideally, you would follow the same seam line as the rest of the trousers when we're doing this backstitch. However, in my case, the edge of the fabric that's come apart is quite worn away. Therefore, the sewing path I'm going to choose will be on the more durable part of the fabric, and I'll try to avoid that weak and worn out fabric edge. The first step is to cut a piece of thread, and then fold it in the middle to double it up. Usually I use a piece of thread that's no longer than my arm, as I find that that's not so long that it will tangle easily. Feed the ends of the thread through the needle. You want to start stitching a little way before where the seam starts to rip apart. That way you're starting to stitch on a stronger part of the fabric. We'll also aim to finish stitching a little bit beyond where the rip ends, again to make sure that we're securing the end of the thread on a strong part of the fabric. To begin stitching, you need to go in and out of the fabric to create a very small stitch. Don't pull the thread all of the way through, but instead leave a loop. Then take the needle through that loop and tighten. And this secures the start of the thread. And then you need to start backstitching along the seam. Do your best to try and sew along the original seam line, unless, like me, the fabric edge is so worn that you don't want to sew on it. In that case, you'll need to move the stitch line onto a more durable part of the fabric. So you go into and out of the fabric with your needle, like so. Bearing in mind that the shorter the stitches, the stronger they will be. Then you need to go one stitch length backwards and put the needle through the fabric at the end of the previous stitch. Then come up through the fabric again, 2 stitch lengths ahead of that point. So you basically go 1 stitch length backwards and then go through the fabric from front to back. Then move forward 2 stitch lengths and come up through the fabric from back to front. And you do this all the way along the ripped seam, plus a little bit further. Just try and keep the stitch line nice and smooth and the stitches even and consistent. When you're starting off, you'll be very close to the seam, but you can slowly move outwards. As you get near the end, you'll want to bring your stitches closer and closer to the fabric edge. If you were doing this repair on a sewing machine instead, you would just use a straight stitch. Once you've stitched a short distance past the end of the rip, you can then secure the end of the thread. To do this, I do a small stitch, pull the thread until there's just a small loop remaining, take the needle through that loop twice, and pull tight. I then repeat this before cutting off the excess thread. And here you can see the result on the front and the back. And then if we turn the trousers the right side out, you'll be able to see what it looks like on the front. Obviously you can see a few small white stitches, but if these were sewn in a matching colour of thread, these would be barely visible. I'm now going to demonstrate another option for repairing a seam, this time using a ladder stitch. For this technique, I don't need to turn the trousers inside out, but again, I do need to thread a doubled up piece of thread through the needle, just as before. I then take the needle into the rip and up through the fabric a short distance before the rip begins. The needle needs to come up to one side of the seam. Make a very small stitch that's parallel to the seam by taking the needle back through from front to back. Then take the needle through the loop of thread at the back of the fabric and tighten, and this secures the start of the thread. Then bring the needle up through the fabric at the same point. Then move straight across to the other side of the seam line and do another short stitch that's parallel to that seam. As we're beginning stitching, we want to be quite close to the seam line, but later we'll get further and further from that seam. And then do the same again, so you go over the other side of the seam line, straight across, and do another small stitch. And you keep doing the same thing even when you get to the rip. The only difference is that the stitches get slightly further away from the seam line. The edge of the fabric that's ripped along the seam is obviously the weakest part of the fabric, so we want to avoid stitching on that. You might be able to tell that at this point it's very difficult to know where to go into the fabric either side of the rip. And that's because the seam isn't held together at all, so the fabric's all loose. Therefore, I definitely recommend using sewing pins to hold the seam together before you start stitching either side of it. So once you've done that, you carry on with the ladder stitch. Going across the seam, doing a small stitch, crossing the seam again, another small stitch, and so on. And then every inch or two you need to pull the thread to tighten those stitches and bring the fabric edges together. The smaller the stitches you do in this method, the neater the seam will be. Make sure that you don't pull the thread so tight that the fabric all ripples and puckers. But if you do pull the thread too tight, don't worry. Simply pull the fabric along the seam to flatten out the fabric again. Once you get to the end of the rip, bring the stitches closer to the seam line so that the distance between the stitches gets smaller and smaller. Carry on sewing a little distance beyond the ripped seam. Then, once you've finished, make sure the thread is tight enough, but not so tight that it ripples the fabric. Then take the needle from front to back through the fabric. Then you just need to secure the end of the thread using the same method as before. So I just take the needle in and out of the fabric to make a small stitch at the fabric edge. Tighten the thread until there's just a small loop remaining. Take the needle through that loop a couple of times and tighten. And then I repeat that one more time. This time though, I'm not going to cut off the excess thread. Instead, I'm going to do a whip stitch along the entire length of the ripped seam. The whip stitch is a very easy stitch to do, and the idea of doing it along this seam is to reinforce the seam and also help to prevent fraying and further wear along the edges. If you have a sewing machine, you can use a zigzag stitch instead. All you do is take the needle from front to back through the seam edge, and you do this at equal intervals all along the edge. So just go from front to back and pull the thread, then front to back and pull the thread. And the whip stitches kind of encase the fabric edge. And this is the finished result. If you used a matching colour to do this, and especially if you used a sewing machine, these stitches would be hardly visible. I personally think the backstitch is better to use because it's easier to make it neater and also it's a bit stronger. But of course, it's completely up to you. I really hope you found this video useful and thank you very much for watching.